the plenary discussion primarily at exploring relations between the three approaches discussed so far. So historical epistemology or historicized epistemology, history of knowledge, and history and philosophy of science. So as I also said in the introduction, this is the time for you, members of the audience, to ask your questions, to come up with discussion points. And you can do so by clicking the raise your hand icon in the top level menu bar in your screen. But before you do, members from the audience, I would like to give the speakers, the first three speakers, a chance to respond in somewhat more detail to the commentaries from the respondents, hoping that in doing so, they will also start our exploration of relations and overlaps between the different approaches to histories of the sciences. And there's one fortunate circumstance, because I just received a message from Peter Burke that due to an unforeseen situation, he had to leave. So he cannot, unfortunately, join in the discussion. But of course, I hope we'll also take into account in the discussion history of knowledge and its relation to history of science more broadly construed. So feel free to ask questions and raise discussion points, but I first want to give the floor again to Hans-Jörg to, well, take up or return to the questions and the comments from Massimiliano, while also opening up the discussion about the relations between the approaches discussed so far.
Yeah. Maybe I come back to the first point very briefly that Massimiliano has been raising, because this is really an intriguing point, and I think we have to somehow reflect about his. He says historical epistemology is not a discovery, but a relic. Something that we have maybe at times it was, in a way, it has been historically necessary even, or opportune in that sense in the early 20th century, but is something we should we simply should leave behind. Now, whether this throws out the baby with the bathwater, maybe it does. But nevertheless, I think we have to put this kind of idea or notion of historical epistemology or historicizing epistemology really in a broader movement, and this broader movement has been nicely addressed, I think, by Theo Arabatzis, using slightly less compromised terms and just talking about history and philosophy of science instead of using this term of historical epistemology that is historiographically is really laden. Yeah, it carries a burden with it, and so I do not particularly want to stick to the expression itself, in particular, because those who are being credited as having been the people who promoted these ideas themselves did practically not use the term. So you hardly find historical epistemology as a term in Bachelard's writings. It's simply more or less absent. And it was after that it has been taken up. And so that's the fate of many of these terms. So we should not look that much to the terms. A much more interesting question is, and I think this really goes to the heart of the relation between history and theory that we are at least in my opinion, that we are discussing here. And this is also a point that Theodor has been pressing, and we have not so far, nobody did respond to it. Hasok did also not respond to it. Namely the question, what kind of narratives does result from our theoretical or epistemological or philosophical commitments? This I find really an interesting point, because it connects to the very center of doing history of science and doing a philosophy of science that is impregnated with historical questions. That much to begin with.
So any thoughts from the others on this specific topic, on the narratives produced by our philosophical theoretical commitments in doing history of science, writing history of science?
The very simple question: what is a case study?
Yeah. May I say something here?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Feel free to. Yeah.
This is a very, very important and interesting question. You know, what kind of narratives are produced? If we adopt this perspective, if we adopt an epistemological or a philosophical, a wider philosophical perspective on history of science, I think this comes together as a package, as it were, with I don't want to say narrowing of focus, but it focuses the historian's attention to questions and issues that have been philosophically interesting or have been discussed in the philosophy of science community. Okay, so for example, in my own work, when I started looking at the history of the electron, my motivation, to be frank, was philosophical. You know, I wanted to get clear on some philosophical issues about realism, about conceptual change, about discovery, and so on. And I used the historical material to think through in a concrete manner these questions. But of course, you know, this narrows your focus. Okay, you leave other things outside your, you know, the area of problems that you are working on. So perhaps this is a price to pay. But again, this is a price that all theoretical perspectives have to pay, right? I mean, they open up space for raising new questions, but at the same time, they leave things outside, you know, their sphere of interest, so to speak. And we see that with sociological studies or with anthropological studies. So, but what's really important, and I think I want to stress that it's a point with which I ended my talk. No matter the perspective, I mean, the evaluation of the narrative has to be rather conventional. So if I write a story about, I don't know, temperature or about the electron or about the gene, then I really want my conventional, for lack of a better term, colleagues in history of science to approve what I've written. So not to mention, for example, that I've overlooked documents or that I've overlooked developments that were relevant to the argument and so on and so forth. So when it comes to evaluating those narratives, I'm rather conservative. I don't think that philosophical history of science or epistemological history of science comes with its own set of criteria for evaluating narratives. I mean, those criteria have to come from mainstream history of science, as it were.
Hasok, you raised your hand.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. I don't think I can give a good general answer to the question Hans-Jörg raised, but there's one point I would like to make, which is that I don't think there's only one particular type of narrative that philosophical history of science generates. And this is often thought to be the case because philosophical history of science has quite, yes, been dominated by the progressivist or Whiggish type of work. But that's not really necessary at all. I think there are philosophical histories of decline as well. I think there, right, if you give it to Feyerabend, he writes a history of proliferation. Someone similar might write a history of oppression, right, how the dominant paradigm came and squashed all opposition. We might have narratives of controversy, we might have narratives of stasis. So I think, you know, being philosophical is open to all kinds of narratives, just like being sociological, anthropological might also be.
Yes, Jim, go ahead. Your mic is switched off, Jim. Sorry.
Yeah. First of all, I agree with Hasek, actually, that it's impossible to imagine what it's like to write a history that doesn't have a philosophical basis. And I think historians of science do need to think about that all the time. And sometimes I think they've had a rather odd image of what philosophy is. So I also would agree that there are many different kinds of narratives. I suppose there's a couple of points I'd want to raise. One is that there's a whole view of what history is, which at some level doesn't really think about case studies at all. The idea of a case study being effectively, you might have some position, say a philosophical position that your case study is going to illustrate or prove. And I think many historians, general historians, would see the goal, as Peter Burke put it, in terms of ultimately being the goal of a total history, which is of course, a term from someone who wasn't a philosopher, but thought in rather philosophical terms, Peter Brodel. And that kind of point of view, I think for many historians, would be effectively the natural extension of the sort of materialized version of historical epistemology that Hans-Jörg has argued for. In other words, something that relates ultimately the specific patterns of scientific or intellectual developments and places them within much larger material contexts of which their own material constitutes. It kind of leads on to that. And so figures like, for example, Marx, again, would be someone whose long tradition of interpretation would also be important. So I think, I suppose I'm just putting in a word for the idea of looking towards these historical thinkers. And probably the most important aspect of that, which is different from many philosophical perspectives, is what's behind the idea of narrative in the first place. And that, of course, is something many people have talked about very well, but it's the idea of time. I always tell my students that time is the historian's friend, because everything can be explained historically. Because it all goes back to time. It's just you look back far enough and something's going to have historical origin, and you just pick your point of origin and then work from there. So I think that it's really that those points that I really want to raise. But I think it's important to recognize that there are specific issues in the philosophies of historicism and history that I think are especially appropriate for writing history of science, that many practicing historians of science would really want to look to first. And I think that's sometimes, certainly the developments of the 60s through the 70s that have been charted, sometimes move the field away from some of that sense of these contexts. And I think what people are trying to do in many ways in the last 10 years or so, maybe longer, is to move back towards some of those bigger questions from a historical point of view.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe someone has a comment on this, or otherwise I was interested. I'm also interested to hear from all of you since Peter is not here, I will sort of represent him. So the gist of his position, in a sense, is to say, I think it also relates to the question, so what is the history of science history of? So sort of his position is to say, he's not a historian of science, but his position is to say, well, history of science should not only, in a sense, be a history of science, but it should be a history of scientific knowledge among other forms of knowledge. So I was just wondering how, for your different approaches or perspectives, how this position that Peter represents, or this challenge, in a sense, to the history of science limited to what we or what people in the past have recognized as science as being too limited or too narrow, how it relates to your different approaches. So, for example, to a historicized epistemology, it seems to fit in perhaps easier because, well, epistemology questions about knowledge, about the justification of knowledge, etc., or how knowledge gets justified in a scientific context or outside a scientific context. But, for example, in the case of history and philosophy of science, well, maybe the relation is more difficult because, well, its tradition is, of course, to focus on science, well, perhaps to the exclusion of other forms of knowledge. But so I'm just representing Peter and throwing this to you to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words to that.
Yeah.
I personally, I'm very sympathetic to this kind of view that knowledge comes in very different guises. Yeah, I mean, there is knowledge involved in artistic, in art production. There is knowledge involved in householding. There is knowledge involved. Actually, there is knowledge involved in everything. Nevertheless, I think I think we would close our eyes before a historical, I would call it a historical fact that knowledge that we call or think to be scientific knowledge has carved out its own cultural space in history, and in particular since the early modern period, and that to an extent that it now today globally pervades all of our space of living. So it has become an implicit form of life, and nobody can escape that anymore. Not even people living in the Arctic or in the Antarctic or wherever on this planet. It's planetarized. And I think we have all reason to think about what this means, also with respect to other cultural activities, and to try to understand the dynamics that are behind this development. It's a particular conjunction between knowledge and technique, of course, and one that never would have arisen from cooking or from religion, for instance. I think we have to be aware of this, and therefore make to do history of science, a philosophically demanding or a theoretically demanding history of science seems to me to be a very important point. And to try to kind of put it into relation to other forms of knowledges that are still with us. So we are all individuals who do not live in one universe alone. We are living in fragmented universes that are marked by different knowledges, and usually we switch from one activity to the other without being aware of it. But nevertheless, I completely agree with Peter's arguments that we have other forms of knowledge and knowledges that also deserve to be historically investigated, but not to kind of dispose of one because we love the other one. Yeah. So there is place for everyone and space.
Yeah, thank you. And Jim, if I might ask, how does this tie in with your comment at the end of your response? Because you ended with a defense in the sense of history of science, doing history of science. What are your thoughts on this position, this perspective?
Yeah, I think I hope I made it reasonably clear. I very much think that people should study many different things, and I'm very glad to see ways of approaching a whole range of different subjects. And certainly in many of the traditions that I've been in, the kind of subjects that Peter, for example, has focused on sometimes have been marginalized. I think it's probably less the case in the German-speaking and French-speaking worlds, just partly because of linguistic differences and the nature of Wissenschaft and so forth. So I think that it is very important to have that. What I suppose I'd be worried about would be the idea that history of science at some level should disappear or move into a larger history of knowledge just because really, I think actually even, it's not even the early modern period, it's basically probably more like around 1800, maybe even mid-19th century, that science becomes something that's quite distinctive and special in some ways, in Western and colonial, basically. I think that move is quite late, and to say that only that is going to be history of science would be a mistake. But then to call everything else before that knowledge really wouldn't do justice to the foundations of what we have today. So I think a history of art is a very helpful comparison. It's quite clear that our notion of the fine arts is formulated in many ways during the early modern period and through the 19th century in terms of individual creativity and the role of art as opposed to how objects are supposed to engage with spiritual enactment and so forth. It's quite different than what we would think of as art. But would we want to have a history of art that really only began, with the the large displays at the academies in the 18th century? I think that would be too bad, actually. So I think we really have to think about these subjects in a much broader frame. And in fact, one thing I feel quite strongly is that we really need to take much more seriously than we do, not just the early modern period, but we need to really incorporate much more thoroughly material that goes back into the medieval, ancient, and potentially even beyond that, if we're really going to think about what a history of science is. I mean, certainly the core issue with science is the notion of expertise in many ways. And expertise is something that develops with bureaucracies in large cities in the Middle East many thousands of years ago. I learned that from my colleagues in HPS, Eleanor Robson in particular. And I think to ignore that is really to impoverish our subject. So I'd be very sorry to see what she does, say, or historians of ancient Chinese bureaucracies and so forth, not in the end be part of the history of science, even though we have in some ways to always, the moment we get into the subject itself, be very clear that we're not talking about something which is on a kind of trolley path towards the late 19th and 20th first centuries.
Yeah, thank you. I would also like to ask the same question, or sort of to hear from you about this, Theodore. But before I sort of ask you to respond, I would also like to say to the audience that I think it's a good time for you to, if you have a question, want to make a point, please raise your hand, use the icon, and then I can see a list of your names, and then I give you, give the floor to you if you want to ask a question. So please do. But in the meantime, Theodore, I would like to hear from you about this, this perspective on what the history of science should also be, in a sense, and why it should remain in existence despite these sort of challenges to explode it or to implode it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy to say a few things. I just want to follow up on Jim's points, with which I agree completely. But I think that there is an additional problem, and it's related to the motivation for turning the history of science into the history of knowledge. And what was the motivation, according to Peter Berg? That historians of the early modern period didn't feel comfortable calling astrology a science or alchemy a science. At the same time, they didn't want to call it pseudoscientific too. So what's the way out? Forget about science, start talking about knowledge. That's not a satisfactory solution in my view. And why is that? The problem with calling something science is that science is an achievement term, right? So today we consider alchemy or astrology pseudoscientific, and so we don't want to call these activities back in the early modern period scientific. But the same problem appears when we start thinking about knowledge. What is knowledge? I mean, there are many definitions around, right? I mean, if we go back to Plato and adopt a definition that remains very favorable among philosophers, knowledge is justified through belief, right? I mean, no historian would be happy with this definition. I mean, sociologists have their own definition, that knowledge is whatever passes as knowledge within a community, and so on. So what exactly is knowledge? And I think that knowledge also, has that achievement dimension in it, right? I mean, conspiracy theories, are they, do they possess some kind of special knowledge that the rest of us lack? We want to say that. So it's, I think it's a misguided, that motivation comes from a misguided attempt to throw out completely any normative characterization or any normative dimension from history of science, and try to be, completely descriptive, non-evaluative, and so on. But this is impossible, in my view. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you. There are no hands raised yet, but I'm
seeing at least one hand.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, then, okay.
So has his hand.
I'm just missing it.
I see 4 hands. Yeah, 4 hands.
It's the invisible hand.
Maybe you could mention the names, because they don't appear on my screen, so it's a problem on my side.
Javier Ramiro, I see Massimiliano, Rink, Pegu, and Fons de Wolf.
Okay.
These are the names I see.
Elske, could you mention the name on the top of the list?
I think maybe Massimiliano had raised his hand quite some time ago, so maybe it's good if he responds first.
I think Javier was the first, actually. So I mean.
Okay, then Javier, please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much. These talks are really interesting. I have really elucidated some of my ideas, but still I have one question. It's about the demarcation between philosophy of science and history of science. I agree with Theodore that mostly concepts can be historicized in the philosophical concepts, and also technology can be historicized, but I mean, there are objects that came before humans, for example, the planets of the universe. So I would like to know if there's kind of some point where history and philosophy of science has a sharp demarcation, or in some way they can be integrated completely, so eliminate the metaphysics of something that is absolutely eternal, that has not history at all. Thanks.
Was your question addressed to a specific person or for everyone to discuss?
For everyone that want to discuss. I mean, it's an open question.
Yeah, I think we. Can I say something? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have. We are constantly using these kinds of categories: philosophy, history, natural sciences, human sciences, and they are useful because they are part of our curricula and they are part of our university system and everything, and they are taken to be disciplines in a way that we do not we do not question anymore. And I think we have this idea of what constitutes a discipline has itself to be historicized. It's not something that has existed forever, and it's not very long ago, still in the 18th century and in the 17th century, this kind of disciplinary universe in which we appear to live today simply did not exist. It's largely a product of the 19th century. And if you look at the dynamics of the scientific field or all the different disciplines over the 20th century, it appears to be that the effect of that development is that all these distinctions are about to, in a way, to be perforated again. They are no longer these kind of absolute barriers. And I think we have to reflect about this phenomenon, not only with respect to the relation between history and philosophy of science, or history of science and sociology of science, or history and anthropology, but with respect to probably we should go the other way around and start to think about what is the phenomenon that we would like to know something about. And actually, it is for me, and as somebody who is interested in understanding the historical development of the sciences, it is, of course, it is the question of what is behind these dynamics. And obviously need, of course, instruments that, in order to really to kind of try to approach this question, we need conceptual instruments that come from different places, and we should exploit this situation. And I don't see, or let us put it that way, all these distinctions that we have inherited basically from the 19th century should be looked at as historical in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
The philosophy of science does not exist. And the history of science also does not exist.
Any of the others would like to comment on this, or maybe the aspect of the sort of the historicization of the discipline itself, and the role that the historicization of your discipline or approach plays in, well, current status or current ways of doing within the discipline?
Mm-hmm.
In a way, that was also my question or comment, so I can begin if I may. So let me play the provocateur once again, and come back to the question of historicizing epistemology as a relic, because I found Peter Berg's talk on history of knowledge quite illuminating in that regard, precisely to raise that question of what is science and what is knowledge. And it has to do, and that brings me to also what Hans-Jörg just said. So what is science depends also on what kind of philosophy is behind it to look at science. So, and here comes the provocation. This idea that historicizing epistemology is a relic was for me confirmed in the talk of Theodor, not denied or something. And I mean it in the following sense. again, as a provocation, there's a kind of ambiguity there, of a kind of confusion between what is philosophy and philosophy of science. On the one hand, it's just kind of general reflection, critical reflection on concepts, as Hazek said, historians do that as well. You find it everywhere, and I agree with that. That's definitely necessary, but there is a slippery slope then to meaning philosophy not in this very broad, undefined sense, but in a very historicized, institutionalized Anglo-American form. And in that sense, if I would say, I would be critical of this what was called PHS project, because there's this risk of just smuggling in institutionalized philosophical problems on the historical material. I mean, it's not always the case, but there is this risk in that sense. And this has also been the problem with HBS often, why historians found it very strange often, etc., etc. And in that sense, I would still say it's dangerous to also think of it as a continuation of one big tradition of philosophical interactions with history. You have to, indeed, as Hans-Jörg said, look at what kind of philosophy or even history of science is at work. What are the assumptions? What are the ambitions? What does it even want to do? And I would say contemporary Anglo-American philosophy of science has very particular ideas, and it's struggling with these ideas in this proliferation of integrated HBS and philosophy of science in practice, etc. But it's very different from this earlier historical epistemology. So I call for Hans-Jörg to resist to equating them. We should stick to the idea that maybe historical epistemology is something else, or can be something else. At least indeed to preserve that kind of plurality, instead of just all agreeing that we should be philosophical about the history of science. I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot. Any takers on this provocation?
Can I say something? It's a good provocation. I mean, we always run the risk of imposing our present categories, our present problems, our present concerns on the historical material, right? But this is not peculiar to philosophy of science. So if we adopt a sociological perspective, an anthropological perspective, these are our perspectives. I mean, they are not the perspectives of the people that we study. So we always have that problem. Now the question is whether a particular perspective is fruitful, whether it generates questions that enable us to understand what was going on, or whether it acts as a block to understanding. And this has to be demonstrated on a case-by-case basis. And I think the only difference I see between what I tried to do and Hans-Jörg's talk was that we come from different philosophical traditions, right? Philosophical history of science looks quite different when you practice it in a, let's say, continental tradition, within a continental tradition, or whether you practice it from an Anglo-American perspective, whether, the one is better than the other, or whether pros and cons, plus and minuses in both traditions. I think we have to be specific about this. I see the philosophical traditions as a pool of resources that one can draw upon, okay, to investigate particular questions, including historical questions. And even when it comes to contemporary philosophy of science, and I think that Hans-Jörg would agree here, we're not talking about a unified field, right? I mean, there are many perspectives, people doing very different things. So if you look at the philosophy of physics community, I mean, it's, these are techno-macho people, I mean, focusing on very narrow problem. I mean, I'm being blunt, I know. But there are people doing, philosophy of focusing on the philosophy of scientific practice. This is a very different kind of philosophy of science from, traditional philosophy of science that focuses on, the big issues, scientific explanation, confirmation, realism, and so on. So I think what's important is to being open to using, tools from philosophy of science, whether it is Anglo-American or continental. This is not important to me. And then demonstrate on a case-by-case basis that these tools are important, that throw new light on problems that historians, I mean, mainstream historians, if I may use this term that doesn't make much sense, but I think you understand what I mean, that find illuminating. Okay, so there is a certain literature, for example, on the history of temperature. Hansok wrote that book. What do the historians of that period think about it, regardless of Hansok's own philosophical perspective? I think this is a rather straightforward issue.
Yeah, can I just let me add one sentence to Massimiliano's provocations. I think they absolutely greatly enrich our discussions. Otherwise, everybody would have agreed with everybody else. That base is certainly not enough and not what we should do. I have a commitment, and I remain with that commitment. I could replace his historicizing epistemology or historical epistemology with, I already used the term, a theoretically demanding history of science. I'm not a philosopher of science in that sense. I'm a historian of science, but one who is self-reflective about the categories he or she is using in doing this business. Basically, that's it. And my object are the sciences, and my object is not religion.
Yeah. Okay.
But this object, of course, can be divided again into everything depends also on the time frame. If you understand yourself to be a historian, time matters. That has been mentioned already. If I'm writing the history of an experimental system that spans a time of about 20 years, I'm not following one particular the development of a particular concept. All kinds of things can happen in an experimental system. Theories can be overturned. New instruments can come in. Everything can happen. So this is the object of my narrative is something else. It's an experimental system. If I'm looking on a slightly larger scale, I could talk about experimental cultures. They span not 10 or 20 years, but maybe 100 years. Look at in vitro experimentation in the life sciences. It started in the late 19th century, and it took over more or less the whole 20th century, and today it is on the verge of merging into something again, because of the instruments that have come out of it. And if I would still try to have a larger picture, let's say a few centuries, then it becomes really different what kind of thread to follow, what is the object to follow. One good idea, and that suggestion was, for instance, made by Georges Canguilhem, was to follow the history, the vagaries of the and the migrations of a particular concept, and look at the changes that this concept, for instance, the concept of reflex. Canguilhem has followed it over about the period of about 250 years. And we could do the same thing. And actually, I have been trying to do that with my colleague Staffan Müller-Wille, the concept of heredity from the early modern period to the present. So time matters eminently for a historian.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's good. It's nice to see. Well, if you, as you say, Hans-Jörg, perhaps without the provocations, there would be too much agreement. But it's still interesting, I think, to see where the agreement lies. So there's something to do with time. There's something to do with this special thing we call science that changes over time, but still remains something that we can recognize somehow. And this is, of course, interesting also, these overlaps or these agreements. Well, because I think as an outsider would perhaps say, looking at how the history of science as a discipline emerged, or how historical epistemology as a discipline emerged, one would perhaps be led to the conclusion that they have different intellectual commitments or different philosophical programs, in a sense, behind them, not only in response to demands from academia, but also from outside academia, sort of developments in society or developments in politics, etc. So it's interesting to see that there's so much overlap and so much agreement, given the plurality of sort of the histories of the disciplines themselves. Let's move to question, a hand being raised by Rinku Pegel. Please turn on your audio and video, then we can hear you.
Okay, I've just, thank you so much. Actually, my question was to Professor Burke, but since he is absent, I would request Professor Seckert to kind of respond to it. So while he was explaining his last point, and he kind of, dwelt on the three spheres of business, politics, and war, he was talking about, if I got it correctly, information and knowledge in a very fluid way. So my question is that, can information and knowledge be used interchangeably? Or so when does information become knowledge? Or does knowledge itself has to have the materiality of information?
Okay, well, first of all, my trying to impersonate Peter Burke is extraordinarily difficult for a whole range of reasons. So I'm not sure I could really do that. I'm very interested personally in the history of information, but I think it's a very specific sort of aspect of the way that knowledge works. And it is actually, it's not only that it's, I mean, at some level you could say it's more concrete. I think it tends to apply a distinctiveness of unit, which is quite different than most of what we would think of as knowing, whether we're dealing with knowing in terms of manual skills or intellectual conceptual developments. These things, information seems to me a question of managing bits in some ways, and it's something there's a long history of this, and some of the work on it is very interesting, but I would certainly not agree. I don't even think that the people who have proposed a history of information really are proposing it as an alternative to the history of science or the history of knowledge, because it's just too different a sort of thing. And it would certainly be an impoverishment to think about everything that we do, say, at a meeting like this about communicating information. I'm not even sure the most enthusiastic projectors on the internet would talk about information in that broad a sense. I think there's something that's problematic about that. Not least, information has it behind it a communicative model, which is about effectively transmission with where it's either communicated or not, and the whole idea of understanding, which would go behind ideas of knowledge, isn't really present with the idea of information. So I think there's something quite distinctive about it. But it is a worthwhile field, and I think it's quite important to think about as an aspect of these questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have time for one last question? I see a hand raised by Fons de Wulf. Please go ahead, Fons.
Yes, thank you, all speakers. I don't know whether it's a very short question that can be answered in a short period of time, but I had a question concerning the lessons we might learn from historicizing the disciplines. And if you look at the early 20th century developments in the history of science, so the origins of history of science, for instance, in the theories of Georges Sarton, but also the origins of philosophy of science as a discipline in the logical empiricist movement, then you see that these origins, that what is central to these actors is that philosophy of science, history of science has a cultural significance. and that it cannot, well, and that it must have this cultural significance, that they do not want to be just another academic field being or producing theories on its own. And I was just wondering how all the speakers today think about, well, the role of or whether philosophy/history of science should strive to have cultural significance. Should we attempt at such a thing or not?
Thanks. It's a great question, big question. Anyone who likes to respond? Who has a ready-made answer to this question?
Yeah, I think I already hinted to my answer in saying that occupying ourselves with and trying to understand the dynamics of the sciences is a reflexive enterprise that is part of our culture, very much so. And I personally am not very, and I have never, throughout my whole career, I have never been very much interested whether history of science becomes a discipline in that narrow sense, and whether it is located with the philosophers or located with the historians or located in a particular science. For me, all of that is possible. It's a reflective activity that in a way should be made to have more impact on our general reflection on cultural issues. We are used to respect the history of the arts as a kind of permanent reflection about artistic production. The same with literary production. And I think the same with scientific production in all its historical changes should also belong to our culture. It has to be a part of our culture, I guess, much more than it used to be in positivistic times back 100 years. Although, as you rightly tell, these people at the beginning of the 20th century definitely had an agenda, a cultural agenda, be it the Vienna Circle or historians and philosophers of science in the first 3 decades in France.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry, but we have to end today's first session, and I very much hope that we can continue and take up these sorts of questions and reflections in the second session and the